Hello, class. Welcome to our discussion of Chapter 19 of the 12th edition of Miller's Business Law textbook. And in it, we're going to basically discuss the formation of sales and lease contracts. And for those of you who have not taken Business Law 1 for a few semesters, you may want to do a refresher. There's a refresher of basic contracts concepts also attached to this module, and you can access that at your leisure. But in this chapter, we'll be discussing some differences between what you learned in Business Law 1 and how commercial contracts are structured. Particularly, we're going to be looking over the next few chapters at contracts for the sale or lease of goods. Those are treated separately. But first, I'd like to take a minute just to talk about what the UCC is. You'll recall that uniform laws from Business Law 1, uniform laws are those laws that are advisory. They're devised as an advisory set of potential statutes that may be adopted by individual states. And in many cases, particularly successful provisions, including the contracts provisions, are adopted by most of the states. So we'll be looking at certain Uniform Commercial Code provisions this semester, specifically those that relate to contracts and those that relate to the sale or lease of goods. However, there are a number of other types of contracts that are impacted by the Uniform Commercial Code, including certain contracts for commercial paper, certain secured transactions. There are a number of areas where the UCC becomes important, but understanding the UCC in relation to contracts will open up the rest of that world for you. All right, so let's begin. So the Uniform Commercial Code is divided into articles, and then those articles are divided into individual sections. The articles basically give you the broad topic that is being addressed within that portion of the Uniform Commercial Code, and the sections give you specific topics within that broader topic. All right, and so in Chapter 19, and again over the next several chapters, we'll be looking at Articles 2 and 2A of the Uniform Commercial Code. Article 2 deals with sales of goods, and Article 2A deals with leases of goods. So when we talk about sales contracts, we'll be looking for statutory references in Article 2, and when we talk about leases of goods, we'll be talking about Article 2A. So the provisions will largely track one another, but again, a sale is a different type of transaction than a lease, as we'll see. So there are some differences that need to be noted. And as mentioned, the UCC is a model statute, and once it's adopted, it has the power of statute. And so where it's been enacted, the UCC controls the provisions that relate to that particular topic, and where the UCC is silent, the common law of contracts will still apply. In addition, in the case where the parties agree to something different than what the UCC provides for, then generally speaking, the parties still have freedom of contract, and they can agree to alternatives to what is provided as the standard under the UCC, and that is in the case where that is permitted, and that is largely the case. And again, as noted previously, the types of sales and leases that are covered under Articles 2 and 2A of the UCC are sales or leases of goods, Goods. Goods are tangible and movable, and they are generally what one might think of when one thinks of a sale. Tangible and movable goods include everyday items that you carry around with you, food items, clothing items, anything that is tangible, meaning that it has substance, and movable, which, it can be lifted and carried about, right? So if it is a contract for something else, the UCC generally won't apply. What are the types of something else? Well, there are contracts for things like real estate. A real estate generally is not a good. Well, real estate's certainly not a good. There are some, we'll get to a bit of a caveat in a bit. In addition, there are intangible property that can't be included in this definition of goods. These include things like stocks, bonds, certificates of deposit, others kind of certificated property that represent something else. Your proxy that you may vote when it's time to vote your corporate shares. These are all intangible property, and they are not covered by the Uniform Commercial Code. So again, we're talking about sales and leases of tangible, movable property, goods, right? In some cases, contracts may cover more than one thing, right? We'll get to that in just a bit. But first, let's start with our first statutory provision. You guys have copies of the relevant provisions of the UCC in your book. Also, doesn't hurt to have a copy of the UCC. You can obtain it online, or you can just sort of buy a copy of the UCC. They're not expensive. They're very handy to have. But the first provision addresses what is a sale. What is a sale? What does it mean to sell something? So the UCC defines a sale as the passing of title from a seller to a buyer for a price. That is the UCC Article 2, Section 2-106, Sub 1. That's 2-106, parentheses, 1 in parentheses. And so that definition, title, the passing of title from a seller to a buyer for a price. Definitions are important, right? Title is any indicia of ownership, right? So in general, like your car, for example, has a title. My boat has a title. Those are formal documents, right, that are in a particular form that represent that ownership interest, but it doesn't necessarily have to be something so formal, right? My purchase of a candy bar at the store, right, comes with title to the candy bar that I buy, right? It's not necessarily certificated, but the receipt could be evidence of that ownership. In addition, the seller obviously is the person who is disposing of the good, and the buyer is the person who is acquiring the good. And price, again, if you recall from Contracts 1, the price does not have to be money, and it doesn't have to be monetary. However, there is a consideration that has to pass between the parties. So the first case example in Chapter 19 is case example 19.1, which is a Nautilus Investments Corporation versus Sheeran Investments LLC, right? And Sheeran Investments is the seller in what is known as an installment sale. So this is a sale that occurs where the seller transfers the subject property to the buyer, right? And the buyer pays over time, right? So in this case, Sheeran Investments sold to a Mr. Blasini the Attic Bar and Grill, which was located in Omaha, Nebraska, and Blasini was paying out over time. He was paying on the assets over time. So he made some type of down payment, took the business, right, and then essentially began paying out as if he were renting a car, except for at the end of it, obviously, he would own the property. It's called an installment sale. Now, Mr. Blasini, when he acquired the business, obtained insurance and was making the monthly payments in accordance with the contract on the assets. A fire broke out, and this fire severely damaged a lot of the assets, including tangible and movable property, including furniture and equipment that was used in the business and which were involved in the sale. And the purchase price at this point has not been fully paid because Blasini is ongoing, paying on these assets. So then Nautilus Investments is the company from whom Blasini obtained the insurance, and they are unclear as to whom the property is insured, right? But they're unclear as to whom the payment should be made, right? Even though Blasini obtained the property, right? They're trying to figure out who's got the insurable interest here. So it had to go up to the appellate court for them to determine that this sale involved goods, right? So why would that be? It's sort of background, but when you sell a business, there are many things that are for sale in that business. And we'll get into that mixture and how that mixture affects the analysis of whether the UCC applies in a moment when we talk about mixed contracts. But for the purpose of this contract, the question was whether the UCC applied. They determined that there were sufficient goods involved in this sale for that to apply, right? And then the question becomes, if the UCC applies, right, to whom the payment should be made by the insurance company. And this question arises because the purchase price has not been paid. If you look back to the definition of a sale under UCC 2-106 sub 1, right, it says that the passing of title from a buyer to a seller for a price is the definition of a sale, right? But if the purchase price has not been fully contended with, if it hasn't been fully made, then is there a passing of title? Because the person who has the passing of title, right, to whom the title has passed, right, or who holds the title at the time that the injury is received, is the party to whom the insurance is payable, right? So they look to UCC 2-401, right, which determines when title has passed. And they determine that title to goods passed on to Blasini at the time of the contract. Basically, when he made his down payment and they signed that contract and he took that business over, knowing that the majority of that purchase price was not yet paid, Blasini took title to the Attic Bar and Grill in Omaha, Nebraska. What is the result of that? Well, it's because of this, right, that Blasini is entitled to the insurance proceeds regardless of whether the purchase price has been completely paid or not, right? So what's the impact of this? Well, this means, for example, that Blasini can repair the bar and continue to operate it so that it brings in money so that he can continue to pay the seller, right? So if this case had come out another way, it would have sort of been like paying the seller, right, without giving the buyer a way to continue that asset or to continue using that asset or to make it more difficult. Certainly they wouldn't have the insurance proceeds, right? So that's case 19.1. That's Nautilus Insurance Company versus Sheeran Investments, and that helps us define a sale, right, by looking at UCC 2-106 sub 1, and it also helps us define when title passes by looking at UCC 2-401, right? So there are two main ways that contracts for goods can be mixed with other types of contracts, right? A contract for goods can be mixed with a contract for real estate, and a contract for goods can be mixed with a contract for services. In those two situations, we again look to the UCC in order to determine whether the UCC applies to the goods that are covered under the contract. And again,